Made with Spoken. The Artist's Duel, a novella from the world of My Muse, My Love, by Soncerée. Digital narration, performed by Jessica Ann Bogart. In the obsidian tower that stood above Vellum Heights like a blade against the night sky, Apollo Beaumont stood transfixed. His eyes landed upon the image that glowed on his screen, a digital apparition holding him captive. There, displayed with audacious boldness, was a painting that made fury rise hot and immediate. Cashmere, his greatest love, his exquisite obsession, his divine inspiration, but not rendered in the sublime poetry of his own masterful vision. This was something else entirely, unflinching and brutal, challenging the very foundations of his artistic supremacy. The unknown artist had painted her as a marionette, strings of tarnished gold extending from her delicate wrists like chains. Her luminous brown eyes, which Apollo had spent months perfecting in layer upon layer of glazed precision, here reflected something hollow, empty. Her rich brown skin, which he rendered with careful gradients and golden luminosity, appeared sallow in this interpretation. Her halo of natural curls seemed subdued here, constrained, as though her very essence had been dimmed by invisible bonds. "Sacrilege," Apollo whispered. But it was the title that truly ignited something dangerous within him. The muse consumed. He heard the door open. Cashmere entered with her usual warmth, that radiance he'd tried so many times to transmute to canvas, the soft scent of jasmine following her as she set down her bag and crossed to him. "Hey, you," she said softly, wrapping her arms around him from behind. Apollo turned, pulling her into his arms. For a moment, her presence cut through the fury, warmth flooding where cold rage had been. He kissed her softly, but the disdain returned the instant their lips parted. She drew back slightly, her hands resting on his shoulders, her dark eyes searching his face. "Apollo, what's wrong?" Her smile faded. "I assume you haven't seen the commentary online?" The words hung between them. Is it just the latest gossip, or something we actually need to be concerned about? Another one of those crude paintings has surfaced. Another one? Cashmere's expression shifted, something going still behind her eyes. "There's no need to subject yourself." "Apollo, show me." He hesitated, then turned the laptop toward her. And there it was. Cashmere gasped softly, her hand rising to her mouth. "I know, it's ghastly," Apollo said quickly. "The brushwork is unmistakable. I suspect it's the same artist as before." She stared at the image, unease settling somewhere deep. "It's just—" She swallowed, her throat tightening around the words. "I don't even know how we're supposed to respond to something like this, or if we even should." "I'm not sure, but we can't tolerate them doing this with your image." Apollo's intensity built. "This crosses every boundary, and it's escalating." Cashmere's head snapped up. "Escalating? What do you mean, escalating? I thought there was only one other painting." Apollo's expression shifted, caught. "There's been at least 4 that we know of." "We?" Apollo hesitated. "Lydia is the one who initially told me—" "Lydia? Of course, Lydia." Something in Cashmere's tone hardened. She always has her hand in everything. A pause, frustration building in her chest. "Pull them up." Her voice was composed but firm. "All of them. I need to see everything you've been hiding." "Cashmere, you don't need to see all of these. I didn't want you to get hurt. I want to see them." Apollo exhaled, then pulled them up one after another. The first was restrained, almost careful. Cashmere, standing alone, distant, placed high above the viewer's reach. The second stripped more away, her figure fading at the edges, as if she were slowly being erased. The third was colder, more deliberate, Cashmere rendered as an object of display. And then the marionette, sharper than the others, less interpretive, more accusatory. Cashmere stopped there. She didn't speak. She didn't look away. Apollo remained still beside her. In the cold light of the screen, he saw something shift in her expression, a quiet faltering she didn't try to hide. "How long?" her voice barely above a whisper. Apollo didn't answer at once. "How long have you been keeping this from me?" "They began after the Crimson Story broke," he said. "Not long after." Her eyes lifted sharply. "That long?" "We were already under siege," he replied. "Paparazzi at the door, headlines, speculation. I wouldn't add another blade to your back." Her expression didn't soften. "You don't get to decide what I can bear," she said. "I was trying to protect you. Just stop." She interrupted him. Silence settled between them, broken only by the muted sounds of the street far below. "When I saw the first one," she continued, "it didn't feel dangerous." She paused. "But this one, it's more visceral. Seeing myself like this, it doesn't feel harmless." Apollo crossed to her, his hand gentle on her face, seeing the tears forming in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know this is hurtful." His voice softened with genuine tenderness. "I didn't make it any better by keeping it from you." She turned away from him, back to the computer. He stepped closer, but she kept her eyes on the screen. "But this one is more dangerous. It's not critique, it's accusation. We can't let them decide how you're seen. I won't allow it. We will find a way to stop this." "How can we?" she asked, still not looking at him. "Apollo, this is just someone's opinion. You can't shut down everyone who has something negative to say." "Cashmere, you're not required to accept this in the name of critique. This person, this artist, has a voice. People are taking notice, and he's sending out the wrong message." Apollo stepped back, exhaled in frustration, and drove his fingers through his hair. Pacing for a moment, he turned back to her. "They dragged me through the mud, and I survived every attack. You were by my side through all of it." She still didn't look at him. "Cashmere?" She still didn't respond. "Moonlight, please." He reached for her, pulling her away from the profane images into his arms. "I won't let anyone defame you." She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "I know you won't, but this isn't your fight alone, Apollo. This is happening to me. I need to be part of deciding what we do." "You are, of course you are, and I'll protect you, just like I always have." That night, Apollo roamed the penthouse through pools of shadow, unable to rest. The painting burned in his mind, refusing to release its hold. It was unfathomable that a version of Cashmere could exist that resisted reverence. The contradiction unsettled him, demanded an answer. In their bedroom, Cashmere slept fitfully, dreams fragmenting into nightmares, herself in a mirror, but the reflection thinning, growing translucent, disappearing, line by line. She woke alone in the thick darkness, heart racing, unable to sleep again, but said nothing when Apollo finally came to bed, holding her in the pre-dawn hours. Morning arrived with the insistent buzzing of Apollo's phone. He surfaced slowly, Cashmere's scent lingering on the pillow. He reached for the phone, Lydia's missed calls flooding the screen, media alerts stacking in urgent succession. The muse consumed had escaped the digital realm. It now occupied real walls in his city. He sat up, pulse sharpening, but his movements remained measured. The sheets beside him still held her warmth. From the bathroom came the steady rush of water. She was still showering, unaware. From the edge of the bed, he called Lydia back. She answered before the first ring completed. "Apollo, thank God. Have you seen?" "I've seen." His voice was steady. "Tell me exactly what's happening." Someone wheat-pasted that painting on the community board across from the gallery. It's massive, 4 feet tall. Media showed up 20 minutes ago. Photographers, reporters, Nocturne Arts Review. Apollo's jaw tightened. "Cover it, post something over it." "No," her voice sharpened. "It will look like censorship." "Lydia." "Apollo, you have to deal with this. We ignored it online. Now it's on the street. The media is already here. If you don't show up, it looks like you're hiding." Acknowledging it gives them what they want: attention, validation. And ignoring it gives them power. The story is being written right now, with or without you. The last thing we need is for Nocturne's most visible artist to look afraid of this witness. Witness? His brow furrowed. That's what they're calling the artist online, assuming it's a him. You're making my point. This person is nobody. My attention makes them relevant. They made themselves relevant by targeting you. Her tone shifted. Cool. Analytical. Build intrigue. Escalate. Force a public response. If you stay silent, they escalate again. It's a smart strategy, and one we have to counter. Silence stretched. Fine, he said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Lydia, don't let anyone touch it until I've seen it. Understood. He ended the call and stepped into the bathroom. Morning light caught his reflection. Lines sharp, control intact. Fury burned beneath. He splashed cold water against his face, droplets sliding from his jaw as he met his own gaze. Cashmere? He called over the shower. Good morning, she said, peeking out of the shower door. Do you want to jump in? She smiled mischievously. I wish I could, but we don't have time. We need to go to the gallery right away. Do you have an appointment this morning? No, the painting. It's no longer just online. Someone put it up across from the obsidian. The press is already there. Overnight? It appears that way. He didn't wait for her response. Stepping out of the bathroom, he pressed Aldrich's contact. Aldrich, bring the car. We're going to the obsidian. I'd like Akamo to come as well. Understood, sir. 10 minutes. Apollo moved through his morning routine with swift precision, completing the look with his signature black leather jacket, making him look every bit like the rogue artist. Cashmere dressed in intentional elegance, her natural curls swept back to reveal the graceful lines of her face. I thought we weren't going to respond to the painting until we decided together, she said. Apollo paused, meeting her eyes. They are forcing my hand, Cashmere. We have to act. His voice softened. Please, let's discuss this in the car. Aldrich and Akamo were waiting when they descended, the Adorno's engine purring softly. Akamo opened the rear door without a word. During the drive, Apollo's phone buzzed relentlessly, alerts stacking, the witness's work spreading through Nocturne like wildfire. Cashmere watched the city beyond the tinted glass. We should not go down there right now. Apollo turned to meet her eyes, his own dark, with controlled frustration. The media is already there. If I don't show up, it looks like cowardice. Or it looks like you're above responding to provocation. Her voice carried gentle reason. We need to let this die down. The scenario has changed. I don't have the luxury of waiting. You do, she replied. Silence is power. That's not how the art world reads silence, Cashmere. Her composure sharpened. Silence makes people lean in. If we don't show up, they leave. And all they can report is that we haven't responded. That puts the narrative back in our hands. He leaned back. In the meantime, it hangs across from my home gallery like a public indictment. Your work was challenged, she said evenly, but it's my face on that wall. The words settled between them. Lydia thinks we need to strike while the iron is hot. It sounded more like justification than strategy. Are you in this with her? She asked evenly. Or with me? Is she in those paintings? Or am I? She is our media representation. He paused, and she felt the shift. If she knows how to handle the media so well, Cashmere continued, why isn't she speaking for her gallery? Why are we being rushed into something we haven't agreed on? This is a public challenge now. I can't sit back and do nothing. I'm not asking you to do nothing, she replied. I'm asking you to think before you react. Charged silence filled the car. As they neared their destination, press flashes flickered against the morning light. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. I'm here, she said, but I don't agree. The car slowed to a stop in front of Obsidian. Cashmere slipped on her sunglasses as the crowd surged forward. I don't feel like dealing with bloodhounds today. Stay close to me, Apollo murmured, brushing a kiss against her cheek. Akamo stepped out first, carving a path through the press. Camera flashes erupted when Apollo's door opened. Voices collided as reporters surged forward, questions indistinguishable. Mr. Beaumont, Cashmere? Is it true? A statement. Apollo's arm came around her immediately, pulling her close. Too tight. Protective. The last time a photographer grabbed her, Apollo had sworn it wouldn't happen again. Still, her body braced. Cameras and microphones pressed in. Aldrich and Akamo cleared a path. The crowd pressed forward anyway. The glass doors closed behind them with a heavy thud. Lydia was waiting. She looked composed as always, but her stance was too rigid. Her hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. Apollo, thank God you're here. She crossed the space quickly, her hand closing around his arm, a touch that lingered a moment too long. Cashmere recognized the maneuver and let it pass. I've been working out an approach, Lydia said, looking up at him. We need to act fast. The media presence is only going to grow. But Cashmere was no longer listening. Her attention drifted to the tall windows. Across the road, she saw it. The muse consumed. Her own doppelganger, rendered in stark contrast, watching, impossible to ignore. Apollo and Lydia's voices faded as she moved toward the glass. Curiosity, dread, recognition. The composition was sophisticated. Even at a distance she could see that. Whoever had made it understood light, understood form, understood how to make a viewer feel. But it was the expression that held her. She looked diminished. The glow people always spoke about had been leached away. In its place, something hollow, accusing. It felt different in person. Online, it had been dismissible. Here it was unavoidable. They hadn't asked, hadn't sought consent, had taken her face and made it an argument. And yet, fear. Not of the painting, of what it revealed. This artist, this witness, had seen something she'd refused to name. The exhaustion, the vigilance required to exist inside a spotlight neither she nor Apollo had intended. Not just against photographers who grabbed at her, but against the slow erosion of self that came from being constantly observed. She was tired. And somehow, a stranger had seen it. Apollo had painted her countless times, her warmth, her strength, her radiance. But had he ever seen this depletion? Or had she never allowed him to? The memory rose. An exhibition opening, a critic asking Apollo about lighting. Apollo beginning to say, Cashmere suggested, the critic turning away before he finished. It had happened so often she'd stopped correcting them. Interviews asking him about technique, inspiration, process. Asking her what it felt like to be his muse. When had she stopped pushing back? She couldn't look away from the painting. Not with those knowing, accusatory eyes staring back at her. Of all the images and portraits made of her, Apollo's reverent studies, magazine spreads, photo shoots, this one struck closest to the nerve, rawest, most unbearable, most true. Her hand lifted to the cool glass. How could a stranger see what she had barely allowed herself to acknowledge? Cashmere, what do you think? Apollo's voice reached her from a distance, muffled. What do you think, Cashmere? Sharper now. She turned slowly. The gallery felt overexposed, edges too clean, light too bright. Apollo stood a few steps away, Lydia beside him, both watching her. I already told you, she heard herself say, her voice unfamiliar in her own ears. Speaking to the press right now isn't the best approach. Have you been listening to this discussion? Apollo asked, the words barely anchored. Behind him, Lydia's voice cut in. You understand this is happening because Copper Goddess is being considered for the Grand Veritas medal? None of my artists have ever been considered for anything this prestigious. I can't allow this to be taken from you, from Obsidian. Is that all you care about, Lydia? Apollo's voice went cold. This is about Cashmere and me. Fragments. Metal. Prestigious. Obsidian. Apollo responding, Lydia countering. But none of it felt immediate. The painting still held her. And the voices behind her continued, discussing optics, awards, narrative control. as if the narrative hadn't already slipped beyond them. She didn't want to hear it anymore. Apollo's voice cut through the tension with controlled authority. "Lydia, I'm making the final decision here." He turned toward Cashmere. "Cash," he said, his voice low but certain. "We own Nocturne right now. The culture of this city revolves around us. We are its sun and its moon. They want to hear from us. We have to answer that call." He held out his arm to her, an invitation, a request, and something closer to insistence softened by the gesture. Their eyes locked. He knew she did not agree with confronting the press in this moment. She knew he was asking her to stand beside him anyway, to embody unity even where their convictions diverged. After a breath, she removed her sunglasses. If she was going to step into this spectacle, she would face them directly. She moved toward him and took his arm. "We're taking control of the narrative," Apollo said, composure restored to its polished edge. "Let's go." When Akamo opened the doors, light and noise rushed back in. They stepped forward together, Apollo at the center, Cashmere at his side, Lydia slightly behind, security framing them. Camera flashes ignited the moment they crossed the threshold, and yet Apollo only needed to lift one hand before the crowd quieted enough for him to speak. "I'll make a brief statement and take a few questions," he said, his voice carrying natural charisma honed to a professional edge. When you're in the spotlight, provocations like this are par for the course. It shows people are passionate about the work, engaged with artistic discourse. If anything, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. He continued briefly, controlled and gracious. When he opened for questions, hands shot up. Apollo pointed to a reporter in the front. "Vikram." "Vikram Nair, the Criterion. Apollo, do you think legal action should be taken against this artist for defaming Nocturne's muse?" the reporter called out, gesturing toward the poster, not acknowledging Cashmere standing right there. Apollo's expression didn't change. "By Nocturne's muse, you're referring to Cashmere?" He paused to let his reply stand. "That's not for me to decide. I'm not a legal authority." He pointed to another reporter. "Yes, Orpheus." "Orpheus Caro with Nocturne Arts Media. Apollo, do you and Cashmere want the artist who created this work to step forward?" Clearly, they want to remain anonymous. It's much easier to issue critiques from the shadows than it is to take responsibility for them and for any harm they might cause. Orpheus interrupted with a follow-up. "Are you saying this critique is damaging?" "I am saying critique without respectful discourse, without honor, can be harmful, yes. This next question will be the last, by the way. Indy, go ahead." "Indy Sterling, Nocturne News. How does Cashmere feel about this artist they're calling the witness, using her image for this bold critique?" Apollo didn't hesitate. "Cashmere is just as bewildered as I am that—" Cashmere stepped forward. The movement was minimal, half a step, but it altered the balance. She aligned herself fully with the microphone, her presence precise. Apollo turned toward her, his expression smoothed, but not before a brief flicker of surprise. He recovered with practiced grace, yielding the moment without comment. Lydia, positioned behind, stilled. Her posture remained impeccable, but the calculation in her eyes sharpened. She faced the cameras directly. "I don't condone using another person's image without their consent," she said evenly. "That matters." She paused intentionally. "But I don't believe art exists to keep us comfortable. If it isn't making us question something, then it isn't finished." A murmur rippled through the press corps. Cashmere stepped back into place beside Apollo. Apollo inclined his head. "Thank you all for your time." "Wait, Cashmere." "Cashmere, over here!" "Miss Wellspring, just one question." The calls overlapped as the formation began to move, cameras still firing, attention shifting. Apollo turned, guiding Cashmere and Lydia back through the glass doors of Obsidian Gallery into its calm shelter. Aldrich and Akamo cleared the remaining press from the entrance. When the street had finally emptied, Apollo turned to Aldrich. "Come with me," as he crossed the street with deliberate purpose. As he got closer, Apollo realized this wasn't the actual painting. It was a poster. The artist could have plastered the entire city, but chose here, across from obsidian. A direct provocation. A purposeful agitator, Apollo concluded. No doubt they believe themselves to be painting a manifesto without any comprehension of the harm they do to her reputation, to the sublime poetry I have woven around her image. Looking closer, he could see brushstrokes, textures, the underpainting. This was a high-quality print. As Apollo studied the technical execution with the merciless eye of a master craftsman, cold recognition crept through him. This artist possessed genuine skill. The way they had captured Cashmere's bone structure, the subtle play of light across her skin, the emotional resonance in her eyes. It displayed an intimacy with his subject that Apollo found deeply, personally, absolutely offensive. "They have been watching her," Apollo whispered, "studying her, learning her contours as I have learned them, memorizing her expressions as I have memorized them." The thought was maddening beyond endurance. He turned to Aldrich with barely controlled fury. "Paint over it!" "Wait." The word came from behind them. Apollo turned, startled. "Cashmere, what are you doing here?" She had crossed the street without announcing herself, standing close now, her attention fixed on the image. "I wanted to see it up close," she said. "You can see more detail here than online. The compression flattened it," she said. "I'll admit, there's some artistry here. A shame it's misguided," Apollo said. Cashmere leaned closer, tracing the composition with her eyes. "Apollo," she said again, softer this time. "Did you notice this?" "Notice what?" She pointed just beneath the jawline, where the negative space narrowed into something almost imperceptible. "That," she said, "that's not accidental." Apollo followed her finger. There it was, a small, deliberate shape worked into the composition. "It looks like," squinting his eyes, "a keyhole." He leaned in much closer, angling his head to catch the light just right. Yes, there it was, a keyhole, cleverly integrated into the composition. "It's a signature," Cashmere said, or meant to appear as one. She straightened, brows knitting. "I've seen it before, on other work. I just can't remember where." Apollo studied it another moment, then shook his head. "I haven't seen it before." He took out his phone and snapped a photo. The keyhole signature, the brushstrokes, the technique. He would unveil the creator. "We need to cover it," he said to Cashmere. She stayed where she was studying the poster for another moment, then stepped back, allowing Aldrich space to work. He rolled white paint onto the wall, starting at the top. Thick strokes, heavy coverage. Paint slid downward in uneven rivulets, cutting through the image, dripping over the crown of her hair. Cashmere watched as the paint crept lower. The forehead disappeared, then the brow. For a moment, the eyes remained. Those eyes, hollow, knowing, locked on hers through the descending veil of white. Aldrich rolled again. The eyes vanished. Paint swallowed the face entirely, dripping down over the rest of the body. Cashmere turned away. Her hand found Apollo's arm, fingers tightening briefly, instinctively, as if grounding herself in something familiar. He didn't pull away. She stood there until nothing remained. The wall returned to blankness, the last traces of the image dissolving beneath fresh paint, bleeding into the pavement below. That version of me is not allowed to have a voice here. Not in this world. Not in this narrative. When the wall was clean again, she released him and stepped back. Elsewhere in the city, the workshop smelled faintly of oil paint and turpentine, old wood, metal, and things made by hand. A television sat on a scarred work table, its volume low, the image washed blue with age. A figure stood with crossed arms, eyes fixed on the screen. Against the walls, multiple renderings of Cashmere stared like voiceless witnesses, their painted eyes seeming to track his movement. He had expected deflection, spin, a rehearsed dismissal wrapped in elegance. When Apollo began to speak, he exhaled, already bracing himself for the familiar choreography of power protecting itself. Then Cashmere moved towards the microphone. Not hesitation, not retreat, a deliberate claim of space. And it changed everything. Lucien leaned closer without realizing it, his attention sharpening as she spoke, not defensively, not apologetically, but with ownership, with clarity. When she finished, he released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Yes. A short celebration escaped him before he could stop it. Not victory. Validation. He hadn't made the work to speak for her, only to see whether she would recognize herself in it, and she had. For the first time since he'd put brush to surface, he allowed himself a thin, incredulous smile. The work had landed. That night, while Cashmere slept, Apollo withdrew to his study. He began with the most recent image and worked backward, following the digital trail, articles, interviews, forum threads buried within Nocturne's underground art networks. The keyhole insignia surfaced again and again, scattered in public places. All of it led to Lucian Cross, a muralist, known for work described as raw and unfiltered, pieces that resisted polish in favor of immediacy, making no attempt to soften or explain themselves. Apollo studied the portfolio longer than he intended. He pushed back from the desk and began to pace. His thoughts returned to Cashmere, to the measured calm of her voice at the press conference, to the care with which she had chosen her words. Art did not exist to keep anyone comfortable. If it failed to provoke questions, it was unfinished. She had said it without defensiveness, without concession. Apollo considered what questions the muse consumed had raised in her mind, and whether they had been meant for her at all. He could not know Lucian's motive, only that the work was a provocation demanding response. By midnight, when the city below had surrendered to sleep and only the dedicated and the damned remained awake, Apollo reached a decision. Apollo and Cashmere spent the next morning discussing the decision Apollo had made regarding how he wanted to handle the situation. Cashmere. He set his coffee down with controlled precision. I'm struggling to understand your resistance to this. We're going to demonstrate that our narrative, our image, belongs to us, not to critics who feast on surfaces without understanding the depths beneath. I'm not against expression, but we don't need to be the subject of this person's critiques. We worked to be here, Cashmere. We went through the fire together. He doesn't get to take that from us. I stood beside you when you insisted on pursuing this with the media, and I'm telling you now to stop. Don't do this. Apollo, the outcome is not guaranteed. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying, she met his eyes. Something in his work spoke to me in a way I didn't expect. He went still as if he didn't recognize her. And you didn't want to discuss that with me? I am discussing it with you now, just between us, not through public spectacle. You mean as public as the comments you made at the press conference? She paused. I wondered when you would bring that up. Cashmere, of all the moments you could have spoken up, in interviews, at gallery openings, you choose this moment. You nearly undermined everything I said, and now you're saying this work speaks to you? Please enlighten me. I believe this art is disturbing because it poses questions we've been too afraid to ask. He paused, his voice dropping. And what questions are those? Questions, she began carefully, that could alter the meaning of our relationship. Maybe we need to think about what they're trying to say. Isn't that what art is about? Different perspectives? He moved closer. Do you genuinely believe my devotion harms you? After everything we've weathered, you're telling me this is what it reduces to? Cashmere met his eyes. Of course not. I know your love for me is real, but maybe that love is keeping us from seeing something everyone else can. Apollo gestured sharply. Do you think our love produces the muse consumed? I refuse to believe that. Cashmere's shoulders sagged. What are you going to do, Apollo? You can't stop people from creating art. What would you have me do? Sit on my hands while this artist uses your image and challenges me in front of the entire city? Yes, do nothing. Just for right now, let it die down. He took a deep breath, speaking softly. When I look at you, I remember your face when you saw that image. You say it didn't matter, but I saw it. What they're doing is sacrilege. I have my honor, and I will defend you and our art, even if you can't see it's right." She held his gaze, her breath shallow. "Apollo, I'm afraid this is going to change everything between us, and not in the way you think it will." "No. Once this is over, you'll see I was right to defend us, and we'll be as strong as ever." Lucien Cross' studio and workshop occupied a converted warehouse in the Foundry district, its exposed brick walls bearing the evidence of years of large-scale work, paint in layers old enough to have become part of the architecture, murals mapped across surfaces in various stages of completion. The space wasn't chaotic or pristine. It was functional, adaptive, designed to let ideas evolve visibly. The message arrived at precisely 2:47 p.m. The delivery came not through modern channels of digital communication, but via courier, a young woman draped in obsidian livery who materialized from the shadows like a specter bearing tidings from the underworld. She carried an envelope crafted from cream-colored paper, so fine it seemed to glow with inner light, sealed with actual crimson wax stamped with the initials AB. Lucien, who had been working since early morning on his most recent commission, an installation of considerable scale, accepted the envelope with faint bewilderment. The handwriting within was immaculate, each letter formed with precision, yet mingled with something dark and dangerous. "Mr. Cross, your recent interpretation of a subject most dear to my heart has come to my attention. While I acknowledge your technical competency, such as it exists, I find myself compelled to address the fundamental misunderstanding your work represents. You have taken it upon yourself to paint a woman whose image you have appropriated without regard for what that violation means. A woman whose inner light requires sophisticated artistic sensibility to properly illuminate. Your crude political allegory does disservice not only to her honor, but to the artistic vision we have built together. A collaboration whose foundations you have no basis to assess. I propose we settle this matter in the manner befitting artists, through demonstration of our respective gifts. I challenge you to a duel of the brush, a formal painting competition, both of us working from the same subject in the same moment. The terms, Saturday evening, as twilight falls, in the aureate green beyond Vellum Heights, canvas, oils, and 4 hours to create your masterpiece. The subject will be Miss Cashmere Wellspring herself, should she consent to serve as our mutual inspiration. Should you accept and lose, you will cease these critiques and refrain from using Miss Wellspring's image. Should you decline, I shall consider the matter closed and your previous work a confession that you have overstepped the bounds of critique. Nocturne's cultural representatives will serve as our tribunal, one worthy judge from each of several districts, along with Miss Wellspring herself, who shall have the final voice in determining whose interpretation more truly captures her essence. I await your response. Apollo Beaumont. Lucien read the letter 3 times, the furrow in his brow deepening. The contrast between his reality and the one implied by the elaborate epistle could not have been more stark. "He's actually challenging me to a duel," Lucien murmured, "like we're in some Gothic romance." Beneath the disbelief, colder clarity settled. He had painted the muse consumed because something in Apollo's work had unsettled him for months. The portraits of her bore an air of finality, as though the subject had been brought to rest within the frame, with nothing left unresolved. The letter only reinforced that impression. Apollo didn't write like an artist entering dialogue. He wrote like a custodian defending a sacred object. Cashmere appeared less as a subject than his territory. Lucien exhaled slowly. The arrogance. There was something almost magnificent in the audacity of it, the classical certainty. In another era, this conflict might have demanded swords. In Nocturne, it would be settled with canvases. He crossed to his laptop, the letter still in hand. The browser remained open to the article he'd been rereading. Apollo Beaumont's Copper Goddess emerges as frontrunner for the Grand Veritas Award. A work anchored entirely in Cashmere's presence, now positioned as inevitable triumph. not because it questioned anything, but because it presented its vision as beyond question. Lucian felt the familiar tightening in his jaw. He opened his blog. The responses to his announcement that the Muse consumed had been mounted outside Obsidian Gallery scrolled past. Finally, someone said it. "You're braver than the rest of us." "Keep going." "It's about time someone put Beaumont in his place." His gaze lifted from the screen. Against the wall, 3 earlier versions of Cashmere, each darker than the last, building toward something. On his easel, the Muse consumed. The culmination, the marionette, the one he couldn't pull back from. The irony registered, the critique and the offense. Were they the same gesture? He didn't dismiss it. He let it sit, uncomfortable, instructive, before returning to the distinction that mattered. His work interrogated meaning. Apollo's asserted it. Lucian lifted his phone, photographed the cream-colored envelope and its crimson seal, and uploaded the image to his blog. Beneath it, he typed 2 words. Challenge accepted. The Oriette Green had stood through 100 cultural evenings, but none quite like this. Upon a stage framed by the night sky, 2 easels faced inward toward a central dais, the subject's seat caught in warm gold. On the platform below, tables and chairs had been arranged with careful precision, velvet and crystal completing the tableau, while servers in obsidian livery moved between them with seamless efficiency. Nocturne's cultural world had gathered. Collectors and critics, patrons and press, those who shaped aesthetic discourse, and those who simply wished to witness history being made. Torches burned at intervals where ancient trees stood sentinel, their flames steady against the night air. Apollo arrived as twilight fell, stepping into the frame with the confident authority of a man who had not come to prove anything, only to remind. He wore charcoal wool tailored to precision, his white shirt stark against it. In his hand, a mahogany case of brushes, polished, deliberate, unmistakably chosen. Firelight caught in his dark hair as his wine-dark eyes swept the gathering. The crowd parted before him, murmuring greetings of support as he acknowledged them with a slight nod. Apollo. Lydia was waiting at the edge of the stage, sleek in emerald silk, her smile perfectly positioned for the audience. "Are you certain this is necessary?" she asked discreetly. "I've taken control of the narrative, Lydia. You declared with certainty that we should respond. I'm providing the required correction." She studied his profile. "And if the evening doesn't unfold the way you expect?" Apollo's smile was composed. "Then it will still unfold as it should. Art has never answered to consensus. But I'm not worried. Neither should you be." Her gaze held his a fraction longer than protocol required, assessing, appreciating, before discipline reasserted itself, a faint blush rising in her cheek as she looked away. A subtle smile touched the corner of Apollo's mouth, and without a word he inclined his head and walked up the stairs to the stage. From the western wing of the stage, Lucian Cross ascended the stairs with the controlled ease of someone who had already settled the question at hand. He moved toward his easel with singular focus, without deference to the elaborate staging around him. Claiming his place, he stood rooted and unyielding, as though the stage had always been his to occupy. His gaze lifted and found Apollo's eyes watching him from across the torchlit stage. "There are evenings," Lucian said evenly, "when outcomes feel preordained." The air between them drew taut. Lucian extended his hand. "Lucian Cross." For a brief moment, something sharpened in Apollo's expression, a cool resentment he didn't trouble himself to hide. He neither stepped forward nor retreated, only held Lucian's gaze. Lucian remained unmoved. "Apollo Beaumont," he said, finally accepting the hand with a grip that was both precise and unyielding. "I've been waiting to confront the man who believes himself entitled to make such bold declarations about the meaning of my work," Apollo said, his voice controlled but unmistakably charged. Lucian met his gaze without defensiveness. "You didn't have to wait. You could have come to my studio at any time. Based on your letter, you knew exactly where to find me. There was no need for all of this. public spectacle. He gestured briefly at the assembled witnesses. Apollo's expression did not soften. You invited public spectacle, he replied. I merely elevated what you already established. You framed your interpretation as authority. Interpretation isn't authority, Lucian said. It's response. Response, Apollo echoed, a humorless edge touching the word, does not require an audience. Lucian's tone remained measured. Once a work is released, the audience already exists. For a moment, the air between them stilled, conversation nearby thinning as attention drifted toward them. You mistake visibility for permission, Apollo replied coolly, and deliberate provocation for artistic discourse. And you, Lucian responded just as calmly, mistake devotion for definition. That landed. Apollo held his gaze, anger coiled tight beneath immaculate restraint. Be careful, he warned. Lucian inclined his head once. I am. Before the confrontation could sharpen further, Aldrich appeared at the side of the stage, a brief, discreet signal. Apollo noted it and excused himself without ceremony. The Adorno was waiting at the edge of the aureate green. Aldrich opened the door and Apollo extended his hand. Cashmere stepped out, silver blue silk the color of moonlight moving with her. Apollo recognized the dress instantly. He had commissioned it for the My Devotion exhibition opening. Moonlight, he greeted her warmly, bringing her hand to his lips, the gesture carrying the tender language of shared intimacy. His gaze moved over her slowly, heat surfacing in his expression before discipline could reclaim it. You wore our dress, he murmured. He stepped closer, his voice dropping just for her, fingertips tracing the silk lightly. A slow, deliberate path along the fabric. You look extraordinary. Her pulse quickened, warmth spreading through her at his nearness. Tonight felt like it called for something that belonged to us, she replied softly, holding his gaze. For a moment the evening fell away, just the two of them inside it, the torches, the crowd, the weight of what was at stake dissolving into the small, charged space between them. They are waiting for you. Are you ready? He asked. Yes, she answered as she took his arm. A red carpet carved a velvet path toward the stage. The moment they appeared upon it, the crowd responded. Applause rising naturally, voices warm with delight. Oh, how romantic! Look at them. Stunning. The string quartet shifted seamlessly, their music softening into something that felt almost celebratory. Apollo and Cashmere walked without hurry, at the unspoken pace of those accustomed to being watched. He was composed, attentive, devotion given form. She moved with her natural grace as applause unfurled around them, like a tide, warm and admiring, feeling it wash over her without allowing it to determine her measure. At the foot of the central stairs, Apollo paused, turning to her slightly. Would you like me to introduce you to the artist behind all of the interpretations? He asked. She steadied herself at the thought of standing face to face with the person who had rendered such a disturbing portrayal of her. I would, she said. Then, after a brief pause, I'd like to ask him a few questions. Apollo's expression shifted slightly, recalibrating, reassessing, as though he was seeing the evening through new terms. Of course. He offered his arm, and together they ascended the stairs. The artist stood with his back to the approaching pair, mixing his palette with singular focus. Apollo slowed as they reached him. Cashmere, he said with composed formality. This is the artist known as the Witness. The man turned and recognition struck instantly. Lucian, Cashmere said, surprise breaking through her composure. You're the Witness? Lucian's expression shifted, caught between relief and inevitability. Yes, he said simply. I never thought you'd agree to this. I never thought it would be you. Apollo's voice cut in, calm but sharpened. You two are acquainted? Cashmere hesitated. Yes, Ladies and gentlemen, Theodore Hartwell stepped forward at the center of the stage, his voice carrying across the aureate green as light shifted and attention snapped toward him. Apollo's hand returned to the small of Cashmere's back, guiding, composed. Applause rose as they turned together and walked to the dais, the ceremony reasserting itself. "You must tell me later," he said to Cashmere, his voice low, "how the two of you are acquainted." "Tonight," Hartwell said, his voice drawing the audience into stillness, "we bear witness to something unprecedented in Nocturne, a formal challenge between two artists, each offering their interpretation of one of our city's most celebrated muses." A measured pause. "This contest shall be judged on technical mastery, emotional resonance, and artistic truth, not by popular acclaim, but by those qualified to distinguish craft from vision." He gestured once toward a platform draped in cloth of gold where the judges sat poised and waiting. "I introduce to you our 5 distinguished judges: Indigo Vesper of Sfumato Heights, Sage Blackwood of Provenance Park, Prism Okoro of the Neon District, Professor Maximilian Gray of the Foundry District, and Zephyr Meridian of Chroma Hollow." In front of the 2 easels, Cashmere had taken her place upon the dais. She settled into a natural pose, head angled toward the light, hands resting in her lap. Present. Apollo and Lucian stood at their respective canvases. For a suspended moment, silence held absolute. 4 hours, Hartwell announced. Let truth prevail. Cashmere sat elevated upon the dais, her posture composed with the practiced ease of someone who understood the quiet discipline of being seen. The torchlight caught the planes of her face at deliberate angles, her dark coils spiraling softly at her temples. From where Apollo stood at his easel, she was perfectly framed, neither exposed nor obscured, present without performance. Apollo's first stroke descended upon the canvas with reverent precision, Prussian blue tempered by the faintest breath of umber, that private shade he alone had learned to recognize in her eyes, not discovered in spectacle, but earned through proximity. What he chose to paint held as much gravity as what he chose not to reveal. He knew the secrets of her expression, the unguarded angles, the truths glimpsed in silence, those he held back. Reverence demanded discretion. The early layers were warmth and light, Naples yellow softened with cadmium, laid thin. In translucent passages he shaped the curve of her throat until light seemed to rise from within. Each decision deliberate, not to impress but to honor. He was not claiming her, he was protecting what he loved. The audience leaned forward, drawn by something beyond mastery, love, rendered legible. Across the stage, Lucian worked with different conviction. Where Apollo moved immediately to canvas, Lucian began by simply looking. A minute passed, then another. His brush remained still, his gaze moving across Cashmere with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that seeing came before marking. Apollo noticed. His eyes cut briefly across the stage, reading the stillness as hesitation. He returned to his own canvas without comment. When Lucian finally began, his early marks were loose and disconnected, color laid without apparent intention, the composition refusing to declare itself. A stir moved through the platform seating as Orpheus approached the judges, mic in hand. "This is the first time we're seeing Apollo paint her in real time, Mastienum," he said, his voice carrying the measured authority of Nocturne arts media. "How do you think the 4-hour limit will affect the outcome?" "It changes nothing," Sage Blackwood replied, his gaze fixed on the canvas. "If anything, it sharpens his brilliance. You can see how completely he knows her." Indigo Vesper tilted her head slightly. Technical mastery under constraint is impressive, certainly. Whether constraint reveals or conceals, that remains to be seen. As the night progressed, the contrast between the artist's methods sharpened. 2 distinct languages emerging from the same subject, the same light, the same focused resolve. Where Apollo built in careful, translucent layers, Lucian worked in a way that seemed, to those watching, almost uncertain. A painting that appeared to be finding itself rather than executing a predetermined vision. His colors were earthier, his brushwork marked by responsiveness rather than reverent restraint. He did not seek to refine his subject into permanence, but to meet her where she stood. Orpheus returned to the judge's platform with renewed interest. Lucian Cross is largely unknown outside certain circles in Nocturne. What's your assessment of his work so far? Technically unpolished by traditional measure, Prism Okoro replied. But admittedly, there's an honesty in the execution that's difficult to dismiss. More than difficult to dismiss, Dr. Gray countered. What's developing on that canvas challenges how we define artistic authority in this city. Cashmere remained still, perched on the dais. Attendants approached offering water, the faint brush of a damp cloth at her temple, a pillow placed behind her back. She accepted these without breaking the line she held. Through it all, she was silent. Silence, she knew, was not emptiness. It was decision. Stillness was not the absence of movement, but the management of it, a deliberate connection, held long enough to let meaning pass between observer and observed. They were painting her, watching her, but she was not absent from the act. She had 4 hours to watch, to think, to deliberate, to sit with the questions she had been carrying about Apollo, his work, Lucian's critique, about why she had agreed to this at all, but most of all about herself, her place in all of this. At the center of it were things she needed to answer, not for the crowd, not for either man at his easel, for herself. She had 4 hours to turn it all over slowly in the golden light. On the stage, the torchlight moved across both canvases in slow, restless waves, shadows shifting over wet paint, the work itself seeming to breathe and resist in equal measure. "You paint her like a saint," Lucian said during a brief break, his voice carrying no mockery, only the plainness of someone who spoke without ornament. Apollo paused his brush. "I paint her, as love perceives her," he said evenly, authority in his tone, "as someone worthy of reverence, not reduction to commentary masquerading as art." Lucian's gaze moved from the canvas to Cashmere herself. "What if she doesn't want to be revered?" he asked. "What if she just wants to be seen?" The words landed, not because they were clever, but because they were exact. The memory rose unbidden. A small cafe, her fingers curved around her cup. "I've learned that attraction and compatibility can feel like the same thing," she had said softly, "but they're not. I want to know I'm seeing the whole person before I get too invested." Apollo had smiled then, unsettled by the recognition. "That's what drew me to you," he'd said. "It feels like you see past the polish." He lowered his brush. Lucian hadn't known that moment, couldn't have, and yet Apollo understood that Lucian wasn't speaking from memory, but from attention, the same perception that led Apollo to devotion and reverence. The realization aligned with an image he'd resisted. Lucian's gaze in the muse consumed, fixed on Cashmere with a steadiness that now felt impossible to dismiss. Apollo's eyes shifted, drawn against his will to Lucian's canvas. It held a refusal to elevate, to take the qualities he had spent months learning to see and lift them into something beyond the ordinary. "You mistake simplicity for profundity," Apollo said, returning to his canvas. "True artistry requires the discipline to perceive beyond the surface to essential truth. What you call authentic, I recognize as reductive." "And real love," Lucian replied quietly, "means seeing someone clearly enough to paint them as they are, not as you choose to see them." Apollo's brush stilled. "You're in love with her," he said, the words emerging before he had decided to speak them. Lucian did not answer at once. His gaze flicked briefly to Cashmere. "That's not what this is about," he said, the deflection itself an answer. "You still haven't said how you know her." Apollo did not look up. He pressed his lips together, a slow breath leaving him. Lucian didn't answer. He only looked at Cashmere again, briefly, before returning to his work. "Time," Hartwell announced. Both men stepped back, the withdrawal carrying more weight than fatigue alone. Apollo's painting of a radiant and serene Cashmere had resolved with sovereign authority, her form exacting and controlled, her eyes holding something that belonged to him alone. the whole bearing the disciplined assurance of a classical master working at the height of his command. Lucien's had arrived differently, and later than comfortable, uncertain until it suddenly wasn't. The loose marks of the earlier hours coming together in the final stretch, revealing Cashmere in light and shadow, uncontained by interpretation. The brushwork visible and unapologetic. Where Apollo had lifted the moment into something eternal, Lucien had stayed inside it. Zephyr Meridian rose from the platform with ceremonial gravity. "Before we deliver our verdict," he announced, his voice carrying across the aureate green, "we believe it essential to hear from the subject herself." Every eye in the assembly turned to her. "Miss Wellspring, we would be honored to hear your thoughts on what these two men have made of you." Cashmere rose with quiet inevitability, as though the decision had already taken root within her. Around her, Nocturne held its breath. Apollo remained beside his canvas, squared shoulders, a faint, restrained satisfaction settling at the corners of his mouth. Across from him, Lucien did not look at the judges. He looked only at her, as though trying to read the decision forming there. Cashmere stepped first toward Lucien's canvas and studied it without hurry, her gaze moving across the lines and color as though reading something written in a language she alone had been taught. Lucien watched her as she took in the work and saw something register in her eyes. Then she looked up at him, and whatever passed between them lingered just long enough to matter. Not forgiveness, not accusation, recognition. It moved through Lucien visibly, the tension easing from his shoulders, his chin lifting as though something inside him had just settled into place. Apollo saw it. The faint satisfaction at the corners of his mouth cooled. Cashmere turned and crossed to his canvas. She stood before it longer than she had stood before Lucien's, taking in its precision, its devotion, the careful preservation in every line. When she finally looked at him, in her eyes he saw love, still there, still real, but threaded now with something that did not bend toward his assumptions. A weight dropped through him, sudden and hollow, as if the ground he trusted had shifted beneath his feet. Finally, her attention drifted to the crowd. She reached into her purse, the movement so unhurried it felt ceremonial. She withdrew the handkerchief, ivory lace, fine and unassuming, her initials stitched in silver thread, and held it up lightly between her fingers. A hush sharpened. Somewhere in that silence, the city leaned forward. The air shifted the way it does before a storm breaks. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might let it fall, might play the role Nocturne had written for her, might offer the clean, satisfying ending the crowd wanted with their verdict intact. Instead, she folded it. Once carefully with precision like visible restraint. Then again slower, her eyes holding Apollo's with steady certainty. She did not choose a painting. She refused the frame. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice, forcing the assemblage to listen harder. Silence concentrating power. "You've both painted versions of me," she said. "Apollo, you painted the woman who reflects your love. Lucien, you painted the woman who made me question. But neither of you painted the woman I choose to be." The sentence moved through the amphitheater like a current. Lucien did not smile, did not step forward, did not claim the moral high ground the crowd might have offered. He only inclined his head once, an acknowledgement that carried no victory in it, only reckoning. The crowd's attention shifted, and suddenly everything hinged on Apollo. He could have spoken, dressed himself in eloquence, turned the refusal into another narrative he controlled, performed humility in a way that kept him at the center. He stood very still, the options moving through him in the space of a breath, his gaze fixed on Cashmere. He looked only at her. Then slowly he took a single step toward her, not a claim, a question. He stopped, leaving the space between them intact. And in that unfinished gap, the evening's true verdict lived unresolved and breathing. Cashmere did not move toward him. She did not move away. She simply held his gaze, and the night held its breath. Morning light poured through the penthouse windows, washing the marble floors in pale gold and turning the skyline of Nocturne into a glittering mirage suspended beyond the glass. The city looked untouched from this height, clean, composed, invulnerable, its towers rising with the same quiet arrogance they had worn the morning Apollo first stood here, staring at another man's vision of the woman he believed he knew. This morning, Apollo stood at the same easel that had once cradled Found in Her Eyes and the Copper Goddess. He painted slowly, his brush suspended above a new work, angled just enough to see her face in profile as light fell across it. Cashmere sat opposite him near the picture window, her own easel tilted slightly toward the city, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, brush poised with quiet concentration. He painted her the way he always had, with reverence, with care, with attention to how the light rested against her skin, the line of her shoulder, the curve of her jaw. But this time there was something new to add. The way her hand held the brush, not posed, not ornamental, but steady and intentional. He deepened the faint tension at her knuckles as she leaned closer to her work. From a distance, the figure on her canvas seemed familiar, the fall of curls, the line of her jaw. But the longer he looked, the more the image resisted immediate definition. At her easel, Cashmere narrowed her focus to the shadow beneath the mouth. The brush hovered, not to soften it or sharpen it, but to let it exist as it was. She touched the lower curve, adjusting its weight. The city shimmered beyond the glass, but she did not look at it. She was studying the woman taking shape beneath her brush. One hand rested at her throat, not posed, not graceful, but caught mid-gesture, as if words still lingered there. A thin line of ultramarine traced the edge of shadow along the collarbone, not to dramatize it, but to deepen it. He had been watching for some time when she sensed him move. Apollo crossed the room and stood just behind her shoulder. "May I?" She studied him for a moment, then shifted slightly, making space for him to observe without relinquishing her place before the canvas. Up close, the painting felt alive, the eyes luminous but turned inward, regarding the viewer in a way his portraits had never captured. What is she thinking here? What belongs to her and what she chooses to share? Her hand hovered before she touched the lower lip again, this time with the faintest warmth. The expression shifted, not into a smile, not into defiance, but into something steadier. "Is it finished?" "I haven't decided yet." She wiped the brush clean and signed her name in the corner, Cashmere. "You paint yourself in a different light," he said quietly. He reached, not for the brush, but for her hand. She allowed the warm weight of his hand to settle on hers, his thumb tracing softly across the back of her hand. "I don't want to lose how I see you." Silence settled between them. "Tell me, Cashmere, does that leave room for my reverence?" She thought for a moment, her gaze holding the woman in the painting. Then she leaned back into him. His arms came around her, a kiss gentle at her temple. Her eyes closed for a moment and she let herself rest there, just for a breath. Then she lifted the brush again. The line she placed this time was steadier. He stayed behind her as she worked, sunlight settling across both canvases. Neither was yet complete. "This is a story I started months ago and then stepped away from. It's part of a much larger project I've been building, but this particular piece wouldn't leave me alone. I came back to it recently because it felt unfinished, and because something in it was speaking to me in a different way than it had before. On the surface, the artist's Duel is about two painters competing to capture the same woman, but underneath, it's about being able to tell your own story, about what happens when other people define you, even when they admire you, even when they think they're protecting you. Cashmere's experience comes from something very real. I understand what it feels like to be praised for the parts of you that are easy to celebrate, while your complexity is quietly edited out. I understand how subtle that can be, how flattering it can feel at first, and how, over time, it can start to feel like you're disappearing inside someone else's version of you. Apollo and Lucian aren't meant to be hero and villain. They represent two different ways people try to see someone. One elevates her, one exposes her. Both believe they're right. But neither fully asks who she wants to be. The turning point of the story, when Cashmere refuses to choose between their paintings, is the part that matters most to me. She doesn't pick a side. She doesn't reward one perspective over the other. She steps outside of the framework entirely. That choice feels personal. To me, she represents the part of a person that's comfortable with things being unresolved, with not having everything clearly defined, with standing in the in-between while you figure yourself out. She's not choosing a man in that moment. She's choosing herself. She's embracing loving herself more. And sometimes the bravest act isn't winning. It's not participating in something that doesn't align with what you know to be true. It's claiming your own voice, even when everyone is waiting for you to validate theirs. This story blends a dramatic setting with something quieter underneath. I'm drawn to lush imagery and intensity, but I'm also drawn to psychological shifts, the small internal decisions that change everything. That balance reflects how I tend to process life, emotionally aware, but analytical about what it all means. Even though this piece stands on its own, it's part of a larger world I'm building. The relationships, the tensions, the themes, they continue beyond this moment. But this story works as a standalone because the core idea is simple. Who gets to decide who you are? For me, finishing this felt important, not because it's grand or dramatic, but because it says something honest. And honesty is something I care about bringing to everything I write.
Professional audiobooks in a click.
Spoken.